for me, they're just these really beautiful objects that have a practical function and that I really love working with. And they're lovely to have around, but they're not going to tell me what to do.
Rebecca is a multi-award-winning designer, watchmaker and historian. She is half of the founding husband and wife team behind Struthers Watchmakers studio and workshops. She's also the first watchmaker in British history to earn a PhD in horology, which is the study and measurement of time. And on top of that, she's written a book entitled The Hands of Time, A Watchmaker's History.
It's so much more than a scientific instrument.
Who would you say is the most influential watchmaker?
For me personally, every watchmaker will have their own idea on this.
Rolex or Seiko?
Oh, it's our interpretation, and it's a very handcrafted interpretation and a very human and personal. And that's why it's just this wonderful window into, our relationship with this beast beyond our control.
Well, my guest today is Dr. Rebecca Struthers. How did you find time to write a book when you're so busy restoring and making watches?
It's a good question. I think I should have invented a time machine rather than machines to tell the time. The book itself was kind of my lockdown baby, really. So at the time, our workshop was in Birmingham, which I write about at the start of the book. And we live in North Staffordshire, which is, it's quite a long commute away. So we couldn't really justify getting in and out the workshop. And we actually built a little workshop at the bottom of our garden in a potting shed, but it was so small, it was one in, one out. So we couldn't work at the same time. So I was kind of stuck indoors. And I'd wanted to write a book for a long time, and that kind of created this window of opportunity to just indulge in some writing.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, before we dive into the book proper, Rebecca, I have a few quick fire multiple choice quiz questions for you. It's not too serious, but obviously all quizzes are deadly serious. Rolex or Seiko?
I might have to go Rolex.
Didn't say it was going to be easy.
Possibly, yeah. I'll probably have to go Rolex, but that's just me thinking about it from an investment standpoint, which probably isn't a good... Yeah.
Thinking deeply about this. Is that your final answer?
For wearing or coolness, Seiko. For investment, Rolex. Am I allowed?
Sounds a bit like hedging, but we'll accept that. Question 2, make or maintain? I'm going to force one or the other now.
Maintain.
Excellent. Functional or flashy?
Functional.
Pocket or wrist?
Wrist.
Keep time or make time?
Make time.
Make time, okay.
Yeah.
And ideal time span for a watchmaking project, 6 months or 6 years?
6 years.
Okay, excellent. And the last question, possibly the most controversial, most influential watchmaking nation in history, Switzerland or Britain?
Oh, I've got to say Britain, haven't I? But then I'm massively biased. So.
Well, there could be a little bit of that, but okay. Well, I think that gives us some really important insights for us to sort of ground our conversation in there. So thank you very much for being so forthright. To begin with, could you just set out in a nutshell what's your book about?
So my book is a history of time told through some of the ingenious devices we've invented to measure it, and very much my story kind of as a watchmaker. So it's quite hands-on. I take you inside some of these machines as well as going back through time to explore how they were made and how they were used, and how that can tell us so much about our society and how our relationship with time has evolved over, it's 44,000 years worth of timekeeping history.
It's actually a really deeply personal account. When you set out, was that your intention to begin with, or did you find that just naturally became part of the story?
I think it's hard to separate the two. As a maker, you are part of what you're making, and that's something I'm very aware of when I'm working on watches. So I both make watches and restore old ones. I've worked on watches that are sort of 300, 400 years old, and you see that when you're working on historic pieces. So I'm very aware of that as I make new ones now, that kind of, it's a very personal relationship that you build. And as you mentioned, some of our builds take 6 years. So you get incredibly sentimentally attached and kind of measure these sections of your life by the watches you're creating. And you kind of, the maker becomes inseparably entwined with the object they've created, which, I mean, I love that part of it, but it does make it hard to separate the two. So it felt quite natural in the end, including the memoir alongside with the timekeeping history.
Do you have any principles for craft makers or for those who are following a craft that, or gentle wisdom or advice you would give to people who are wanting to take their creativity to a deeper level or follow a craft?
I think the most important thing is to enjoy it. And I'm a big preacher of the whole kind of you've got to be bad at something to get good at it. And that's very much part of the creative process, especially whether you're starting out from scratch or you're looking to expand on your skills. It's a process, and it takes time and patience with yourself, as well as the things that you're making, to have a go and take those risks and not worry about it if it doesn't work out first time is so important. To give yourself that breathing room, I think. But you've got to enjoy it. You've got to love what you're doing, because it is all consuming at times. So if you're not in love with it, then maybe try a different craft.
So when you were writing this book, who did you have in mind as your sort of ideal reader? There is a surprisingly large, for people who outside of the kind of general watch scene, there is a surprisingly large scene of, we call ourselves watch geeks or watch nerds, with a kind of a hardline interest in these sort of subjects. But for me, I really wanted to write this for the people in our lives who do not get why on earth we're so interested in watches and think we're completely mad. So that was my target reader. It was like, how can I convert people who think, oh, it's just a watch, that's boring, to realise how deep and fascinating and rich this subject is, as part of our human history as well. So that was kind of in my mind's eye, how can I convert everyone to love this as much as I do? You talk about the history of the evolution of timekeeping from its earliest known timepiece from, as we mentioned earlier, 44,000 years ago, and via the use of water, sand and candles. I particularly enjoyed the reference to King Alfred the Great, the West Saxons, and how he used to burn candles, and you described him as a modern day productivity guru, which I thought was quite an amusing thought. And the thing that really tickled me was that if he lived in a castle, castles didn't tend to be particularly well draft-proofed, so I'd imagine he'd encounter all sorts of problems with people opening doors and blowing out his candles and getting into all sorts of trouble, I can imagine.
Yeah, it does kind of, I try to take you back to those sort of moments, really. It's so human. I think this is another one of the many things that I love about you. If anyone reads the book, you'll get that there are a lot of things I love about what I do. But yeah, this for me is why watches and timekeepers are so special, because they are measuring this, as you say, this celestial phenomenon that's completely outside of our control. We have no control over the duration of light and dark and the movement of the moon and our transit around the sun. But there's our very human and very personal way of interpreting that. And that's why it's so much more than a scientific instrument. It's our interpretation, and it's a very handcrafted interpretation, and a very human and personal. And that's why it's just this wonderful window into our relationship with this beast beyond our control.
Absolutely. In terms of sort of a timeline to give people a sort of sense of when the developments happened. So the introduction of mechanical clocks, when did they start to appear?
So you're looking at sort of being about sort of the 14th century, the earliest mechanical clocks. We're not entirely sure whether or not they came out of northern Italy or the UK. It's very likely that the earliest ones haven't survived. But it's around, so the oldest that we kind of know about is from... So 1386. So it's around that sort of date. And this is the point that timekeeping is starting to sweep across Europe. So a lot of the early advances that were made in time measurement came out of the Middle East and of North Africa. And that a lot of that was driven by sort of sundials and clepsydra that can actually be incredibly accurate if they're well maintained and well designed enough. But over in Europe, with our slightly less predictable weather conditions, we couldn't always rely on the sun. And obviously a water clock will freeze in the winter. So that's why you kind of get this drive towards mechanical timekeepers, because they provide something that doesn't rely on the natural elements in the world around us to function.
Yeah, so it's almost like geography is the driver of this innovation in a way.
Yes, yeah, in many ways, geography and religion as well, with Christianity. Knowing the hours of the day for prayer times was very important to people. So the first clocks are actually, the word clock originates from the medieval French and Latin clocker or cloche, meaning bell. Whereas the very earliest clocks were just a bell, they didn't have a dial. So they would just chime out the hour on the hour. In between that, you wouldn't know what time it was unless you had a sundial. You'd have to wait until the clock struck to know the time, and that would sound out prayer times.
And so essentially these clocks would be in the centre of a town, and then I guess they become a focal point for the communities, and as you say, a call to worship. And then it's becoming a kind of a system of coordination between people that starts to allow other things to happen, I guess.
Yeah, and it's the creation of communal time. Because before this point, we all have our own inner personal sense of our time, but it is very personal, and it's open to kind of manipulation, distortion, based on things like our feelings. So, for example, like my internal hour experience might be different to yours. It might vary myself depending on if you're happy, time flies, and if you're bored, then time drags. So, yeah, we have no kind of real regular, consistent way of regulating our own time, let alone on a communal kind of community basis. So these kind of this way of externalizing our time experience and creating something that was regular and could be relied upon was so important in structuring our day as a community. And that could be everything from kind of knowing what time to turn up for market, knowing what time to turn up for work, to meet people, for business and for trade. It created a way that we could start to structure it. So you see kind of the beginning of the end of the work-life balance coming in with mechanical timekeepers.
Of this period where you're getting increasingly sophisticated mechanism and increasingly greater precision, which period of this evolution did you personally find most intriguing and most interesting?
I mean, I talk about the subject that actually ended up becoming my PhD in this book, in chapter 5, which is about the forging of time, which is one of my personal real areas of interest, because I came across, I was working at an auction house and a pocket watch came in for cataloguing to go into auction. And it looked like a quite typical watch from sort of around 1780, 1790. And it was signed Wilter, London. And this was at a point in the end of the 18th century where London was the centre of watchmaking. All the best watchmakers were typically based in and around London. And I started the cataloguing thinking, well, design's a bit weird, but just a watch. Looked up Wilter and we've got a dictionary of watch and clock makers. And it just said, Wilter John, perhaps a fictitious name. And that was it. And this kind of started me off going down this rabbit hole that ended up being the best part of, what are we on now, 15 years of research of trying to get back to the bottom of kind of who this John Wilter was. And it basically transpired that these were a very early kind of forgery. There's no evidence that John Wilter existed as a real person. So a lot of the makers that appear, there are other fake names as well, are completely fictitious. It's just the London, because London was the centre of watchmaking, you could charge more money for a London-made watch, that they were imitating London-made watches in the day before brands. So no one knew the maker, it was all about the city. And that these forgeries were the first kind of mass-produced by their time forgeries. So watches were becoming cheaper and more accessible, as watches before this point have been hugely expensive things. Unless you were very, very wealthy, you wouldn't have had a watch. And it was the beginning of, I suppose, the democratization of time, which is really interesting. So this is the point we start, all of us being able to access accurate time on the move. And also, it was the start of the industry as we know it today. So a lot of these watches were coming out of Switzerland, of all places. So, yeah, you kind of see that these centres for watchmaking cropping up at the end of the 18th century that still exist as centres of watchmaking to this day. And they played a big part in the downfall of the British industry and the rise of the Swiss. So this one little watch that came in by John Wilshire, perhaps a fictitious name, kind of unearthed all of this. And there was so little research on them as well. I could find out so infuriatingly little because, I mean, they're nothing special. I think this happens quite a lot across lots of different disciplines in history, is that if they're not technically anything special, they don't look great, they're not valuable, that they just become not of interest and no one bothers taking the time to study them. And I have a bit of a thing for fakes, and forgeries can tell us so much about ourselves as well. It's a really interesting subject.
You chart the rise and fall of the British watchmaking industry, and you later come on to the Swiss succumbing to the quartz crisis.
Yes.
And I mean, is this story of evolution of watchmaking simply a story of technological advances, or are there other important forces that play a part in this story?
Yeah, it's a combination of so many things. So there's a lot of economic history, cultural history, social history. You get religion even, and religious persecution changes the direction of watchmaking history. So, for example, the persecution of Huguenots in France through the 17th and 18th centuries, you get a lot of French Protestant watchmakers. So there were a lot of artisans amongst the Huguenots, incredible goldsmiths, silversmiths, stone cutters cutting precious gemstones, and watchmakers. And particularly during sort of the 16th, 17th century, you get them fleeing to fellow Protestant nations for safety, including the UK. So you get this kind of flurry of French names appearing on London watches, and of amazingly talented people. And this is at the same time you start to see the London industry kicking off. So they played such an important part in the development of the British and the London trade that would go on to become the centre of watchmaking history, all because of religious persecution. You see similar things as well around the Puritans. Puritans actually changed the design of watches themselves, as watches before that point had been incredibly decorative, and the Puritans were anti kind of that ornamental decoration and luxury. So watches that we call them form watches, actually. They're really pretty little things. They're kind of small enough that you could easily hold one in the palm of your hand and close your fingers around it. And they were made in the form of other things. That's literally why they're called form watches. And I've got a beautiful photograph of one that's a little lion in my book, but you could get, there's a little crystal snail, a snail shell at the British Museum. You get them in skull forms as well. Mary Queen of Scots famously had a watch shaped like a little skull. But these are really decorative things. So as Puritanism swept through Europe in the 17th century, the watch was massively simplified to just a plain little, they were oval shaped, usually in silver. Although even though, and this is, as I mentioned, watch is really expensive, Puritans couldn't give them up completely. You do see very rare examples in gold. So, a bit cheeky, that one, sneaking that one through. They're still very plain, but, I mean, that's definitely a massive luxury for someone.
So it wasn't as if gold prices had sort of plummeted and they weren't the luxury. Gold was still definitely
very
a
much
luxury
so.
And expensive material.
Yeah, as were watches. And this was a point as well where watches weren't particularly accurate. Watches didn't become accurate until later in the 17th century. So, yeah, that you didn't necessarily need a watch. You could have told the time more accurately with a portable sundial than you could have done with a watch. but they still had their watches. Oliver Cromwell was reported to have owned one too. So yeah, it went right the way through the ranks.
And so at that point, the reason for having a timepiece, if it wasn't the most accurate device that was available, what was the purpose of having a watch at that time?
I mean,
why did people have a watch?
Yeah, same as we do today. Some of it will be status. So owning watches, not only did it show that you must be very wealthy to be able to own one of these beautiful objects, but it's also a show of your knowledge, that you have this understanding of the latest science and technology. And this is a point when the aristocracy of Europe would quite often have observatories and have astronomers within the palace. You know, so this is having that knowledge of the latest science and technology was a really important part of demonstrating your power and your status, because knowledge is a luxury and that we take for granted today. It's something that I hope most of us certainly in the West can enjoy, but it costs money and takes time to learn things, and you need to have enough of a disposable income to be able to study. And going back, to the sort of 16th, 17th century, to have enough money to just learn was a luxury. And this kind of, this sort of knowledge as a status symbol is part of that. Watches form part of that. And they were worn in very obvious places on your body as well. So watches right the way up until kind of the advent of gentlemen's tailoring towards the end of the 18th century were worn around the neck or suspended from your waistband. So this was a really obvious way that you could show your friends like that, you know about technology and you have a lot of money. Basically.
The word chronometer, when it's a watch, are all watches chronometers, or at what point does one become one? Is it about precision or? Yeah,
it's about precision through a quite strict series of tests. So chronometers are very, very accurate watches, and they're put through a series of time trials at an official observatory. We used to have one in Kew in the UK. We have one in Switzerland too. And it runs the watch through different temperatures, different positions over a long duration of time, and it has to maintain that level of accuracy throughout all of the conditions we put it through, to be able to be certified as a chronometer. And chronometers were invented by John Harrison of the famous longitude problem in the 1700s. So we still use the term chronometers and create chronometers to this day, but to much, much higher standards now. It's really strict testing.
Which that does segue neatly to how the precision of these instruments led to other developments and progress in terms of navigation and mapping as well. And you mentioned there Harrison. What's the importance of how important was Harrison in the development of the watch?
So Harrison played a part in it was the quest for longitude of the 18th century that started at the beginning of that century with a naval disaster caused by a fleet of ships inaccurately plotting their position by not knowing their longitude, and the ships were wrecked. And I think to this day it's still the worst peacetime naval disaster. Lost a lot of lives, and this was all through our inability to track our longitude. So we navigate based on longitude and latitude. Latitude is our position north or south of the equator, and it's quite easy to calculate based on the position of the sun. Longitude is our east-west position, and if you don't have any visual references, like if you're on land, you can see natural features, it is really, really hard to figure out how far east or west we've gone. So this was a major, major problem for anyone out in the open seas before the advent of the solution for longitude. And even a miscalculation of a few degrees could end in disaster. So this became the kind of key quest over the 18th century, how to calculate this. And at the time, watches and clocks weren't particularly accurate. It just was not believed at all that there's any chance that a watch or clock could be reliable enough out at sea as well. So this is really extreme conditions. You've got extremes of temperature. Ferrous metal does not like salt water. So you've got a lot of magnetic objects on board a ship as well. You've got cannonballs and cannons rolling around, well, hopefully not rolling around all over the place, but all of these can affect
hopefully some of them are strapped down.
So people thought it would be a celestial, that it'd be something through measuring that the moon and the stars would be able to calculate this. And but Harrison believed that a mechanical timekeeper could be accurate enough, designed to be accurate enough to solve this problem. And this was working under the idea that if you could keep track of your time at your home port, you could, as you're travelling, accurately calculate your local time based on, again, the position of the sun. And by comparing your local time to the time at your home port, you could calculate how far east or west you travelled from your start point. But you need a really, really accurate timekeeper to do that. And Harrison was the kind of guy who took on that challenge to solve the longitude problem, to be awarded the longitude prize that the government had set down to anyone who could resolve this. And he initially designed a series of clocks, which were too badly affected by the movement of the ship. And the final piece, H4, which they all reside now at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, was like a giant pocket watch almost. And the design of watches as opposed to clocks is much better in terms of dealing with movement, obviously because we carry them around on our bodies, so they have to be moved around. So H4 is like this giant. You couldn't wear it in a pocket, but it kind of.
It is big, isn't it? Yeah,
it's huge.
In my mind, a watch has a certain dimensions to it, and it's really quite an impressive size.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I think that's another perfect example. This is very much a scientific instrument designed to solve a problem, and yet it's so beautiful. I mean, it's got all this gorgeous like leaf acanthus scroll engraving on it. It's gilded. It's set with diamond end stones. It's beautifully engraved. There's all pattern on the dial as well. None of that is necessary for the functioning of a watch. That's done to make it a beautiful object. So even these scientific instruments were still so beautiful and crafted. That's really important watch. Important for our ability to navigate around the world during a problematic century, which is another interesting thing. So although that the Longitude Prize was set out to help the Royal Navy, chronometers were hugely expensive. They took a long time to make, a long time to test, and even by the end of the century, so kind of 40 years after the advent of the chronometers, it was still quite rare to see them in inventories of Royal Navy vessels. However, you've got companies like the East India Company, so profitable trading companies, would frequently have chronometers on board. So there's a bit of a conflict there about perhaps some of the real reasons why they were being used. But it's still, they played a huge part in our history during that time.
Did you find that when you started to apply the lens of time to social developments, to economic developments, that was it surprising that there are... it's a very powerful lens to look at the world through.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely, yeah. How we use and spend our time. There's so much philosophical work on this. I'm not a philosopher so much as a watchmaker, so I dip my toes into this because I do find it really interesting, this kind of relationship that we have with time and work, and how we're made to feel guilty for not working, and I tried to get to the bottom of where this all comes from. And it is very much a trip back to our Puritans again during the Industrial Revolution. So this, even though this is long past the point of Puritanism being a mainstream religion, you get industrialists touching back on this whole devil makes work for idle hands to do, and hard work is the important part of the quest for godliness and securing our place in heaven, and that we should all be working really, really hard to do that. And that's a huge part of our relationship with work to this day now, that we're taught that we should be working hard all of the time, otherwise we're bad people. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who I do. I do feel guilty. You feel guilty for having a line in the morning. You feel guilty for doing things that just for pleasure. Like I said about taking time and being patient with yourself to do things just for fun and to enjoy them. We're made to feel guilty for that, and it's all part of industrial capitalism of trying to make us as productive as possible for the work environment. It's got nothing to do with anything natural. And you get this regulation, and watches and clocks are part of that. So through chronometers now we prove that watches can be really accurate, and through things like our forgeries, but like by John Wilter, they become more prolific, so more people can afford them. They start to regulate our day further and further. So this moves us completely away from our previous sort of agricultural time experience, which is more natural and more organic, to something very structured. We get into sort of night shifts and shift working as well, which is completely unnatural way for humans to work, but could be regulated through timekeepers. And you even get timekeepers appearing in factories. So this is where I love, like, you look through accounts of the era too. I pull up a couple of examples of factory work hands getting hold of watches, and through that being able to see how their time was being regulated by workshop managers who were putting clocks backwards and forwards to try and get more time out of their workforce. And watches would actually be confiscated if they caught the factory staff with watches, especially if they were informing other people of the actual time. So you can, it's quite grim, some of it.
So it's kind of like this wrestling for control over time, and who controls the clock.
Yeah, absolutely. The control of our time, whether we control our time personally or whether, for employment, employment basically is our employer buying our time off us. So it's not just skills, it's your allocated time that they've purchased from you. But with that kind of trust in that your time will be what your time has been agreed to be. Back then they could do it through putting clocks backwards and forwards, and now they can do it through making you feel guilty for not doing more. Like you should be going for that promotion by putting in those extra hours for free or anything. It's it's the more you look into it, the more you kind of find yourself sitting there thinking, hang on a minute. How this happened? And that's something I talk about with kind of my personal relationship with time as well. The more I've come to terms with this, of understanding where my kind of time guilt complex comes from, and how I've beaten myself up for it through my life to the point of making myself quite ill. That actually, this is something that we need to review. And for me, as a watchmaker doing that, I've at this point in this relationship with watches now, that for me, they're just these really beautiful objects that have a practical function and that I really love working with, and they're lovely to have around, but they're not going to tell me what to do. And I'm not dictated to by them. I find the ticking of a watch or clock quite therapeutic now. We design them to help us, but we've allowed ourselves to be ruled by them. And it's kind of coming back to that. They are beautiful things there to help, but they shouldn't tell us what to do.
So do you find that, having researched and written this book, that you touched on it a little bit there, and that your relationship with time has evolved, and has that manifested itself in any particular ways, in the way that perhaps you work or manage your time?
Yeah, I'm a lot more relaxed than I used to be. So I used to suffer really badly with anxiety and a lot of stress as well. I used to be very, very hard on myself for things like not working hard enough, and I still work more hours than I should. But I'm much better at doing things like having a holiday now. I was very much one of those guilty people of, I'd like to go on holiday somewhere where I had Wi-Fi and a phone signal, so I could keep on top of my emails, not miss out on anything. And I've completely come through that now. I love nothing more than getting out somewhere where there's absolutely no internet or phone and getting away and having me time and allocating time to just be happy. I love gardening. I love getting out my garden. I love my animals. I've got cats and a dog and 2 rescue mice at the moment, and just spending time with them just for pleasure of doing it. And I didn't used to do that.
Sorry, just to I'll pick up the point on the mice. Did I read somewhere that one of the mice is called Morrissey? Is that right?
Oh, so Morrissey passed away.
Morrissey did wonder.
He did. His final act was the most Morrissey act of his entire life. He died in the early hours of my birthday. So his last gesture was to wish me a very unhappy birthday. But he's a very lovely little mouse, actually. It's a sweet thing. But we've got. I was trying to
oh, I see. Have they got? Are they other members of the Smiths or just?
No, these are two girls. We've got this.
Oh, two girls.
Yeah,
excellent.
Morrissey was so named because he came in with some other mice, but he didn't get on with any of them and had to be kept in isolation. So,
yeah.
So it's quite a solitary mouse, but it's very sweet in every other way.
Who would you say is the most influential watchmaker of all time, and why?
For me personally, every watchmaker will have their own idea on this. For me, I love Abraham Louis Breguet, who I talk about as well in detail. So for me, he's not just a fascinating watchmaker, he's a fascinating character. And that's what I really love about him. So he was working through the French Revolution. So it's an incredible point in European history, and he would have seen so much, and he has invented probably the most devices within watches that are still in use to this day. So he actually started out working for the French royalty. He worked in as the official royal watchmaker, making watches for Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. He was commissioned to make a watch for Marie Antoinette by one of her admirers. I suspect there were many. We have no idea which one it was, which was the most complicated watch of its day, and is still one of the most complicated watches in the world to this day, sort of a couple of 100 years later. That was, unfortunately, he was given, well, fortunately for him in a way, he was given an open checkbook. It could cost as much as it had to, and an open diary, which created a few issues because Marie Antoinette was dead for several decades after it was finally completed. So she never saw the finished piece. But he went from making watches for the French aristocracy. The revolution starts. He spends a brief time in exile. And literally he flees with what he can carry, so very limited tools, flees to Switzerland for a while and carries on working, creates some of his most ingenious inventions whilst effectively in flight with very limited tools. So he's just, this brilliantly clever man. Spends a bit of time in the UK as well, ends up going back to Paris at the invitation of the new French Republic to start making watches for the French army. So not only did he manage to kind of keep his head, the French army who'd taken over his workshops had ransacked it and turned it into offices, refitted out his workshop at the state's expense to get him back. He was that admired. He
must have known some pretty influential people.
Well, certainly, yeah. I mean, he made watches for Napoleon directly and clocks in the end. And it's even said that Napoleon would dress up in disguise and visit his workshops. So excellent. He was a huge fan. So he worked for royalty to the French Republic, and most incredibly during this time too, he was making watches for the English aristocracy. So George III and Queen Charlotte was a huge fan because Queen Charlotte and Marie Antoinette had been pen pals for, I don't think they ever met in real life, but they exchanged a lot of letters. So I like to think they were both Breguet fans, and that's how they they heard about him together. But so he made watches for the English during the wars with England then. And he even made a watch for the Duke of Wellington and Napoleon, and kept his head during one of the most tumultuous times in European history. So he was
quite the diplomat.
Yeah, just amazing inventor. He created shock settings, the first shock settings in watches, so that's to protect them from damage if they're dropped or knocked. He invented the first automatic winding system. So that's we think of self-winding watches that wind with the movement of our wrist. He was the first person to invent that over 200 years ago. He invented new forms of we call them repeating watches. So those are the watches that can strike out the time on little gongs. They chime them out to let us know the hours and minutes. And before him, there used to be kind of a big bell inside the back of the watch case that would strike that out. And he invented, they almost look like piano wires, but 2 round wires that go around the movement and allow it to be a lot thinner. And we still use those to this day. So yeah, just incredible inventor, but also must have been the most amazing character to have just worked his way through all these different situations and be so loved by everyone that no one could do him in, let alone not work with him.
It's sort of his skills transcended politics
he was
and
loved
allegiances.
by all. Yeah, it's absolutely incredible. I'd love to have gone for a drink with him. I think it'd have been fascinating.
Do you have a favourite watch of all time? It could be one that you've personally handled or one that you'd very much like to see.
I mean, there's a few different examples for different reasons. So in terms of kind of the most incredible story for a watch that I've handled is of a Movado Weems from the Second World War. And I describe this in detail in the book too, so I won't say too much because I don't want to spoil the story, but it came into us from the son of the original owner, and this watch had survived a plane crash and an absolutely incredible story afterwards of how both the original owner and this watch had made it out of the front line during the Second World War. And
was it 1940? Was it? Was it the? Yeah. Okay.
So
well, I won't say anything. Anything more.
I mean, it's goosebumps, and I've been doing some book talks recently. I read that section of my book; it's my favourite section of my book, and it gives me goosebumps, and I get emotional about it to this day because some people made it and some people didn't, and it's just such an important part of our history. And this is watches as well from the 20th century. We're into an era now where we can share living memories with the original owners of these watches, which makes them so much more powerful too, because this is a story that came from that man to his son, who's now telling me. And this watch, we worked on it to restore it so he could pass it on to his children too. So you're now part of this kind of legacy with someone that we have a living memory with, or his son has a living memory with. So yeah, really, really special. So pieces like that I love working on. And then there's just really beautiful, like beautifully crafted pieces. So the sort of form watches I was talking about, there's one that's made it's carved into a solid piece of emerald that was found in the Cheapside Hoard in London. So this is a buried treasure story in my book. Of this incredible hoard of Elizabethan and Jacobean jewellery that was found by builders digging foundations for a new building in Cheapside in 1912. And they dug up this stash of incredible gold and enamel and gemstone pieces, and within that was this amazing watch. And it's quite small, kind of like, again, kind of easily hold it in your hand and close your fingers around it, but carved into a solid piece of emerald. So it's a little pocket watch. Even the lid of the watch is made out of emerald. The gilded dial has got green enamel on it. It's beautifully engraved, and it's just exquisite. Like the level of skill to carve emerald in that way back sort of in the 17th century. This is when you're working with these things, you're thinking, God, they hadn't even harnessed electric lighting or motors and or have the sort of magnification that we have today, and they're still making these incredible things. So that's one of my favorites aesthetically. And then if there's a watch I could have seen that doesn't exist anymore to our knowledge, there is possibly the first ever wristwatch in history that we have a record of was worn by Elizabeth I. And that appears in an inventory of a wardrobe written in 1572. And it's described as a clock worn as an armlet. And it was gold and covered in rubies and emeralds. And yeah, I'd love to have seen that. Sounds incredible.
Yeah. Were there any paintings of her wearing it? Do we know what it might have looked like in terms of having any sort of sketches or paintings of it?
There's nothing that we know about. And this can be a bit of an issue actually when you're trying to find those sort of watches. And this mention status symbols, actually. If anyone's going around a portrait gallery, look out for watches in portraits, because they do appear. It's literally like celebrities to this day posing with their watches. People used to pose with their watches in portraits. But some of the earliest ones are so much like jewellery, it can be really hard to decide whether or not this is a pendant that's been worn around the neck, or could it be an early watch? Is this an armlet that's a watch, or could it just be a bracelet or a bangle? It's really hard to say. So there's nothing that we know of that's survived. I mean, we could design technically an idea, a concept based on our knowledge of Elizabethan jewellery, but who knows? Who knows? It will probably remain one of life's great mysteries.
Absolutely, but that's kind of makes it more tantalising in a way, the limits of what we know. What do you think are the core skills of a watchmaker? What does a watchmaker need to be good at in order to be a good watchmaker?
Patience again. Definitely a big one for watchmakers. It's interesting. Of all the watchmakers I've known, so I know most people will go their whole lives never meeting a watchmaker, and yet I only ever seem to socialise with watchmakers. I'm surrounded by my husband's another watchmaker too.
I think that's called the red sweater syndrome. You buy a red sweater and then you go out and you only see red sweaters.
I like that. I've not heard that one before, but yeah, just like that with watchmaking. I think that we're all quite different characters, but if there's anything that unites us, it's that moment when you're sat at the bench and you've got your work in front of you, it's silence and it's focus. And you kind of, no matter what your character is outside of that relationship that you have, where you just get into the zone and you can focus all of your energy on this tiny little thing in front of you. I mean, I work on movements that aren't much bigger than a thumbnail at times. And you kind of go into that world, and it's that ability to lose yourself into that and cut off from everything else and just focus is definitely a skill I'd say that unites us. I mean, Craig and I work opposite each other. Our benches literally face each other, and we can barely speak to each other in a day. We're so focused in what we're doing. Though the difference is he likes music. We have the radio on, but I like silence. So I'm miserable.
So do you carve up do you perhaps light a candle when the candles come to the end, then you have to turn off radio 2 or whatever it is that you're...
No, I'm more tolerant, so I've just learnt to live with it. But I have silence if I'm on my own, but I just zone it out. That's part of the zoning out thing, the ability to focus. I just kind of cut off from it, because he can still listen to it as well and be like, oh, did you hear that? And I'm like, what? No, what's happening?
Would you describe yourself as an artisan watchmaker?
Yeah, I think that's probably the closest way to it. We're very hands-on with what we do and very traditional.
So what makes what distinguishes an artisan watchmaker from a standard watchmaker?
Well, there's different kinds of watchmakers. So you get people who do service technicians. They're the most common kind of watchmakers, and they're sort of, if you've got new watches and you take them in for everything from a new battery to having them serviced, and they just take them part clean and put them back together again, and you've got spare parts supply and things. Right the way through to restoration, where you're working on very old pieces with no spare parts supply, and you have to hand make anything that's not there. And a similar sort of thing for making watches too. You get either people who can design using CAD, computer-aided design, and computer numeric control, CNC, where computers and machines can basically make an entire watch from start to finish now. So you don't need the same kind of hand skills. It's an incredible skill of a different kind, but it's not a traditional hand skill. And that's where the majority of the industry is now. So this is why we've had this big loss of traditional hand skills, because, firstly, making in the way that we do is not economically viable. Craig and I are a company of just 2 of us, and we can only make a tiny number of watches a year. Through our completely handmade watches going forward, we're only making 1 a year. So you can't scale up in this way. You have to embrace CNC and CAD to be able to scale up. So that's the direction the industry has gone. But yeah, the hand skills are still really, really special and really important. It's still really beautiful making in that way. and very sustainable to make in that way too, in a different light. So that's kind of your two different kind of watchmakers. You get your high-tech watchmakers, and then you get your oily rag watchmakers like us.
Because of course you make watches. So if I wanted you to make a watch for me, the process of commissioning that, what questions would you ask me? What do you need to know in order to get started on making my watch?
Well, we should start with telling people and warning them, because the sort of processes that we use are so traditional. It also limits what we can do. So we're never going to be able to do these super high tech, mega accuracy kind of watches. They are artisanal watches. So obviously we'll tell the time. That's an important function. But they are, at the moment, our watches are just time only. And as we start to introduce, we call them complications, which is anything beyond telling the time. It'll be really simple things like moon phases or date indication, like nothing super high out there. So we warn them of things like that. We only work in precious metals as well. That's one of our, for the cases, that's kind of one of our principles that I picked up when I was training as a jewellery and silversmith. So it's 20 years ago before I went into watchmaking. And my tutor, who he'd started his apprenticeship at 13 years old and retired the year I finished the course. So he was this phenomenal skill. I was so lucky to go through at that time. And he had the philosophy that you should only work in materials that are worthy of your effort. And we still do that to this day, because you could make these.
That's a really great principle.
Yeah, especially with kind of jewelry and precious metals, because you could make the exact same thing in steel and take the exact same amount of time making it, and it require the same level of skill, but you could only charge a tiny fraction of the price for it as you could with gold, because of the perception of gold. So if you're going to dedicate like years of your life to making something, you want it to be made in a material that is worthy of that time, and that you can charge enough to cover your time in making it. So otherwise you don't have a business. So that's really important part of how we work. So we go through those kind of like, we warn you, this is going to take a long time because we make everything by hand and we only work in gold and we can't do anything too high tech. And this is designed to be a beautiful thing to be worn and treasured. It's not, as we don't do sports watches or things anyway, so you can't go diving or jumping off cliffs in it. This is and once we get through all of that, remarkably people aren't put off and we can start getting to the sort of ideas that they have, and if there's things that they've seen, any concepts that they like, so we can, everything being made from scratch to order means we can incorporate a lot of those kind of bespoke elements of engraving and colorways and different options, and we design stuff for them and send it over to them to see and have input with, and even down to like designing of numerals on the dial or the shape of the hands. These every little element you can play with when you're making stuff from scratch, which it's a real pleasure working in that way.
Just picking up very quickly on the word complication, which you mentioned is an extra feature of the watch that goes beyond timekeeping. I'd not come across it in that sense before, but I actually really like the term. It felt to me almost as if a complication is, yes, you get an added extra feature, but don't forget that there's an underlying unseen level of complication that sits beneath the surface that may be problematic. It might not be, but it just I quite liked it as a term. Is that how a watchmaker would see a complication? That it's a kind of, yes, it gives you a benefit, but it does come with a cost.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if you're trying to repair them because something's gone wrong with one of them. So you can have a watch that's keeping really great time, but one of the complications is gone. And basic complications are anything from date and moon phase, but the most complicated ones can, so we have things called perpetual calendars, and they can mechanically calculate and accurately maintain dates of varying, months of varying length. They can predict leap years. I mean, they can run a calendar accurately for hundreds of years, some of them, all through gearing and mechanics. which is incredibly impressive. You get like split seconds chronographs. So you've got, if a chronograph in itself, that's your kind of stopwatch function that runs on a watch as well, isn't enough. You can get ones that do interval timing mechanically. Grand sonnery watches are one of the kind of most coveted grand complications. And they can do so chiming out the time. They can chime out the minutes, the quarters and the hours, but they can also be set to silent. They can be set to chime automatically as kind of like the hours or quarters pass. Or they can just be triggered on demand if you wanted to know the time right now or hear the watch right now. So you can set all between these different musical settings effectively just with one in one movement. So they can be incredibly complicated. So they're complicated to design, they're complicated to service, and they're really complicated when things go wrong with them and you're going to put it back to right again. Yeah.
What do you see as next for watchmakers? Because you note that artisanal watchmaking is on the Heritage Craft Red List of endangered crafts in the UK, and that with the advent of computer numerical control, smartwatches and fitness heart trackers with all sorts of wellness complications, where do you see the future of highly skilled watchmakers like yourself?
Well, the irony is that there's never, in recent years, there hasn't been a greater demand for independent watchmaking and fine watchmaking as there is now. The demand is huge. The prices for not only independent watches going through auctions now, but also vintage and antique watches which need restoring, and restoration is another phenomenal skill. We are desperately short of good watch restorers. Watch restoration and watchmaking, traditional watchmaking, are very much overlapping disciplines. If you can restore a 200-year-old watch, you can make a new watch now. So, the demand is there. I think the big challenge that we're facing now is that there's been so much skills loss in the meantime. A lot of us have to, Craig and I are mostly self-taught to bring us to what we're doing now. So that takes a long time to do that. We've both been doing this sort of, for me, it's 20 years this year in the industry. So it'll take time for people to pick up those skills, and it takes time to learn watchmaking anyway. Traditional apprenticeships were 7 years, followed by another 2-3 years as a journeyman before you became a master. So I think it will change. I think we'll see more restorers and more watchmakers in years to come, because the market is definitely there. It's just going to take time for that to work through for people to pick up those skills.
How would you complete this sentence? The future is what for watchmakers such as yourself? Exciting.
I think it's a really exciting time. And I'm big, I think, again, coming at this as a historian as well, if you resist change, you will fall. So you need to work with the change that we've got going on at the moment. And there is so much exciting change coming up with not just watchmaking, but our relationship with time itself. And that includes everything from the advent of smartwatches and how they're working alongside traditional watchmaking. But the biggest change that we've got coming up in the not so distant future now will be the way we tell time itself. Because our concept of time as we know it is Earth time, and it works on Earth. But as we start to travel into space and move to other planets potentially and further out into the universe, then our Earth time will no longer be relevant. And how are we going to work our concept and understanding of time as an animal that's evolved around our 24-hour circadian rhythm when we're out in deep space? It'll be really interesting to follow. I probably won't be alive then. I think it's probably a bit too distant for that. But it's an exciting time.
I'd just like to say thank you so much for joining me today, Rebecca. The Hand of Time now is out in the UK and it's out in the US on the 13th of June. And if you'd like to learn more about Rebecca and Craig's watches, you can visit their website. I'll put links in the video description below. And if you enjoyed this conversation, please do check out the other episodes on The Future Is. And if you'd like to support the channel in a tiny way that really helps, then just hitting the like button, leaving a comment and subscribing, all of that's very much appreciated. So thanks again to Rebecca.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for watching, and we'll see you again soon.